When you truly grasp the words, "What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven," something violent happens to passivity inside you. Faith ceases to be a gentle idea and becomes a force that demands expression. These are not poetic words spoken to make believers feel comforted. They are words of authority handed to men and women who dare to believe God meant what he said. Heaven is not waiting for earth to improve before it responds. Heaven is waiting for faith to speak. The tragedy of many believers is not that they lack prayer, but that they lack conviction. They ask when they were authorized to command. Yet Jesus never asked permission from darkness. He enforced truth. When this revelation strikes your spirit, fear loses its legal right to remain. You stop negotiating with circumstances and begin addressing them. Binding is not emotional noise. It is spiritual enforcement backed by heaven's agreement. Most Christians live as though heaven is distant, slow, and reluctant, when in truth heaven is alert and responsive to faith. Binding on earth is not human arrogance, it is divine alignment. When God speaks, he expects agreement, not debate. The words of Jesus reveal a shocking partnership where heaven consents to faith-filled action on earth. This means silence in the presence of evil is not humility, it is ignorance of authority. Faith that never binds never reigns. When you bind sickness, poverty, fear, or oppression, heaven does not question your tone, it confirms your stand. The moment you understand this, prayer changes from pleading to proclamation. You no longer ask God to do what he already authorized you to enforce. This revelation awakens boldness that refuses to bow to visible facts. The power of binding is rooted in intimacy with God, not volume of speech. Authority flows from relationship, not repetition. Jesus did not shout at storms because he knew who he was aligned with. When you bind on earth, heaven does not examine your emotion but your alignment with truth. Many fail here because they attempt to bind without submitting first. Submission sharpens authority. When your will is surrendered, your words carry weight. Binding is heaven-backed resistance against anything that contradicts God's will. The enemy thrives where believers hesitate. But once faith rises, darkness recognizes the voice of someone who knows they are sent. Binding is not control over people, it is dominion over spiritual resistance. This clarity prevents misuse and fuels holy confidence. The reason this truth feels dangerous is because it dismantles religious comfort. If heaven responds to what you bind, then responsibility shifts to faith. No longer can you hide behind God allowed it. When God commanded you to act, Jesus never blamed the Father for storms, he rebuked them. This authority was not reserved for apostles with halos, but entrusted to believers with faith. Binding requires courage because it exposes unbelief. When nothing changes, you are forced to examine not God's power, but your agreement with it. This revelation drives you deeper into the Word, not to impress, but to align. The Word becomes your legal document. You speak it not as a hope, but as law enforced by heaven. Heaven's cooperation with earthly binding reveals God's desire for partnership, not spectatorship. You were never designed to watch history unfold helplessly. Faith was meant to interrupt patterns, not observe them. Binding is spiritual interruption. It is the moment when faith steps into time and says, "This far and no further." Many pray against darkness while secretly accepting it as inevitable. Binding rejects inevitability and insists on divine order. This is why casual belief produces weak results. Authority must be believed before it is exercised. When you bind with conviction, heaven moves because heaven recognizes its own will being echoed through you. This transforms the believer from a victim of circumstances into a governor under God. The enemy fears believers who understand binding because they stop asking for relief and start enforcing truth. Hell trembles not at church attendance but at authority exercised in faith. When you bind deception, clarity floods your mind. When you bind fear, peace establishes itself like a guard. These are not psychological tricks, they are spiritual transactions. Heaven honors faith that acts. Binding is not an event, it is a lifestyle of resistance against compromise. You stop tolerating what Jesus already conquered. This produces spiritual stamina. Weak faith grows strong when it is exercised. Authority unused fades in confidence, but authority practiced becomes instinctive. The believer begins to live alert, bold, and unashamed of spiritual power. Understanding binding also redefines prayer language. You move from, "Lord, if it be your will," to, "Lord, your will is written, and I stand on it." Faith does not question what God already declared. Binding aligns speech with heaven's verdict. This removes confusion in prayer and replaces it with certainty. When uncertainty leaves, peace enters. The believer becomes steady, not emotional. Binding demands clarity of mind and heart. Double-mindedness weakens authority. When faith is singular, words carry precision. Heaven responds to precision. Binding is not about many words, but right words spoken in faith. This causes prayer to become a place of command rather than complaint. Many believers fear authority because they confuse it with pride. Yet true authority produces humility because it flows from obedience. Jesus bound and loosed with meekness, not ego. When you bind on earth, you are not elevating yourself, you are agreeing with heaven's order. Pride speaks independently. Authority speaks representatively. This distinction protects the heart. Binding becomes an act of service, not self-display. You bind darkness so others may walk free. This revelation births compassion with power. Love without authority is helpless, and authority without love is dangerous. Heaven responds where both are present. Binding, when done in love, restores rather than crushes. The delay many experience is not heaven hesitating, but faith wavering. Binding must be held, not merely spoken once. Authority is maintained through persistence. Jesus taught to stand firm after praying, believing it is done. Binding continues until resistance collapses. This is not striving, it is standing. When you bind, you refuse to retreat. Faith does not panic when results delay. It remains anchored. Heaven is not moved by urgency but by certainty. Certainty grows when believers refuse to reverse their confession. Binding requires discipline of speech. Words spoken in doubt can loosen what faith bound. This is why maturity matters in spiritual authority. The revelation of binding exposes how casually many speak. Complaints, fears, and confessions of defeat undermine authority. When you understand binding, you guard your mouth. Speech becomes intentional. You no longer magnify problems because you understand agreement gives power. Heaven agrees with faith, not fear. Binding aligns speech with divine intent. This creates an atmosphere where miracles breathe. The believer becomes conscious that words are not empty, they are carriers of authority. This awareness produces spiritual sobriety. Faith-filled silence can be more powerful than noisy unbelief. Binding teaches restraint as much as boldness. Binding on earth also reveals the urgency of now. Authority is exercised in the present, not postponed to tomorrow. Many delay action waiting for perfect faith, but faith grows by acting. Binding today weakens resistance tomorrow. When believers delay, darkness strengthens its grip. Heaven waits for faith to move first. This truth dismantles procrastination. You realize obedience cannot be delayed without cost. Binding is an immediate response to revelation. Once truth is known, action must follow. This keeps faith alive and sharp. The believer becomes responsive to the Spirit, quick to obey, quick to resist evil. When this authority becomes real, testimony follows naturally. Lives change, patterns break, and peace establishes itself. Not because of human effort, but because heaven and earth came into agreement. Binding creates spiritual order. Chaos retreats when authority stands. This is the inheritance of believers who dare to believe Jesus meant what he said. The kingdom of God is not theory, it is enforcement. Binding is the believer's participation in that enforcement. Once this truth settles, you can never return to powerless faith. You become awake, responsible, and fearless. Heaven is no longer distant, it is actively responding to faith exercised on earth. When authority becomes revelation, excuses die immediately. You can no longer blame family background, culture demons, or delay when you realize heaven responds to faith now. Binding exposes the lie of helpless Christianity. You were never designed to endure defeat quietly. Jesus did not suffer to produce passive believers. He conquered to create enforcers of victory. Binding is how victory is enforced in daily life. The moment you accept this, comfort zones feel sinful. Faith refuses neutrality. You either bind what resists God or you allow it to operate freely. There is no middle ground. This truth awakens holy intolerance toward anything that contradicts God's promises. Tolerance of darkness is not mercy, it is ignorance of authority. Binding awakens spiritual backbone and demands responsibility for spiritual atmosphere. Many believers unknowingly loosen what they bind through careless agreement with circumstances. They bind in prayer and loosen in conversation. Authority cannot operate where speech is divided. Binding demands consistency. Heaven listens not only to what you say in prayer, but to what you agree with afterward. Faith must remain aligned when emotions fluctuate. This is where spiritual maturity is revealed. Binding is not proven in quiet moments alone, but in pressure. When symptoms shout louder, faith must speak firmer. Authority does not crumble under resistance, it is refined. Each resistance encountered is an invitation to reinforce conviction. Binding becomes stronger through opposition when faith refuses retreat. The revelation of binding also dismantles victim mentality. Victims ask why. Believers declare what must change. Binding shifts focus from explanation to transformation. The enemy thrives on believers who endlessly analyze instead of enforce. Faith is not confused by complexity. Authority simplifies. When you bind fear, you do not study its origin, you remove its influence. This is not denial, it is dominion. Heaven does not require understanding before obedience. It requires agreement. Binding is the language of agreement. When earth agrees with heaven, spiritual force is released. This force alters environments, minds, and futures. Binding also requires purity of motive. Authority abused becomes control. Authority submitted becomes deliverance. God entrusts power to hearts he can trust. When binding is motivated by love for God and people, heaven accelerates response. When binding is used to elevate self, it loses sharpness. This is why prayer life must be guarded. Pride dulls authority, humility sharpens it. Binding flows effortlessly from a yielded heart. Such faith is quiet yet immovable. It does not argue, it commands. Heaven recognizes its own nature in that voice. When believers grasp binding, they stop begging God to fix what he empowered them to confront. This does not remove dependence on God, it deepens it. Authority is not independence from God, but expression of God through obedience. The believer becomes a conduit, not a controller. Binding is cooperation with divine will. This removes frustration from prayer. You stop striving for God's attention and start aligning with his intention. Faith rests while authority works. This paradox produces peace even before results appear. Haven is already engaged when faith speaks correctly. Binding reveals why spiritual laziness is dangerous. Ignored authority does not remain neutral, it weakens confidence. Faith muscles must be exercised. When believers avoid confrontation with darkness, fear grows. But when faith engages, fear retreats. Binding trains believers to stand firm. Each act of authority strengthens spiritual resolve. Over time, faith becomes instinctive. You no longer question whether you can bind, you know you must. This knowledge produces stability. Life may shake, but faith stands. Heaven honors that stance with reinforcement. Many prayers fail not because God is unwilling, but because believers refuse to take responsibility. Binding hands responsibility back to faith. It removes the comfort of blaming God for unanswered prayer. This can feel heavy at first, but it is actually liberating. You realize you are not powerless. Heaven has already delegated authority. The believer's role is not to convince God, but to enforce agreement. This transforms prayer into partnership. Binding becomes collaboration with heaven's agenda. When authority is understood, spiritual warfare loses drama and gains precision. No shouting, no panic, no confusion. Just clear resistance grounded in truth. Binding is calm confidence, not emotional warfare. The enemy recognizes authority immediately. He tests it but cannot override it. Faith that knows its position does not retreat. Binding maintains position. This steadiness frustrates darkness. Chaos cannot survive where order is enforced. Heaven supplies strength to faith that remains consistent. Binding also protects believers from burnout. Striving exhausts, authority rests. When you stop trying to move God and start moving in God, energy returns. Faith is not draining, unbelief is. Binding removes internal conflict. You are no longer torn between hope and doubt. Authority requires decision. Once decided, peace follows. Heaven supports clarity. Confusion weakens authority, but decision strengthens it. Binding thrives where faith is decided. This revelation also changes how believers view delays. Delay is not denial. It is resistance collapsing. Binding continues until collapse occurs. Faith does not measure success by speed, but by certainty. Heaven is not rushed, but it is responsive. Binding holds ground until manifestation arrives. This teaches patience without passivity. Faith remains active even while waiting. Authority does not fidget, it stands. Heaven reinforces standing faith. Binding creates spiritual leadership. Others are drawn to stability. Authority comforts those who are weary. When believers walk in authority, hope becomes tangible. Faith becomes visible. Binding produces testimonies without exaggeration. Lives shift quietly but permanently. Heaven is glorified when faith functions as intended. This authority also exposes compromise. You cannot bind what you secretly tolerate. Authority requires alignment in private and public. Compromise weakens confidence. Binding demands holiness, not perfection, but surrender. When the heart is surrendered, authority flows freely. Heaven trusts surrendered vessels. Binding becomes natural, not forced. Understanding binding also reveals the seriousness of words spoken in jest or fear. Loose speech loosens authority. Faith becomes disciplined. You choose words carefully, not out of superstition, but understanding. Speech is agreement. Binding is intentional agreement with heaven. This awareness matures faith rapidly. When believers truly grasp this truth, Christianity shifts from survival to dominion, not domination over people but dominion over darkness. Binding restores God's intended order. Heaven and earth cooperate. Faith becomes functional. The believer walks alert, grounded, and fearless. Authority is no longer theory, it is lived reality. This is only the beginning of understanding. Once binding becomes practice, faith continues to expand. Heaven always responds to faith that dares to act. When binding becomes normal, faith stops reacting and starts governing. You are no longer surprised by resistance because resistance confirms authority is active. Darkness does not challenge powerless people. It tests those who threaten its operation. This understanding removes intimidation. Fear loses its mystery. You stop asking why opposition increased and realize it is evidence of impact. Binding shifts perspective. Instead of retreating, you reinforce. Heaven does not withdraw when pressure increases. It supplies more strength. Authority grows through engagement. Faith that never confronts never matures. Binding is confrontation with purpose, not conflict for ego. It establishes order where disorder once ruled. Many believers misunderstand peace, thinking it means absence of conflict. True peace is authority resting in control despite conflict. Jesus slept in a storm because authority was settled. Binding produces that settled state. Your emotions may feel waves, but your spirit remains anchored. Heaven responds to anchored faith. When you bind, you are not trying to calm yourself. You are enforcing divine order. This brings peace that surpasses feeling. It is not fragile. It does not depend on environment. Authority creates peace, not the other way around. Binding also reshapes how you see responsibility in prayer. Intercession becomes enforcement, not sympathy. You feel compassion, but you act with authority. This prevents emotional exhaustion. Many burn out because they feel deeply but act weakly. Authority channels compassion into action. Binding converts burden into breakthrough. Heaven responds where compassion meets conviction. Tears without authority drain. Tears with authority transform. This balance keeps faith healthy and effective. The believer who understands binding stops waiting for permission from people or systems. Authority is not validated by applause. Heaven validates faith through results. Binding may make you misunderstood, but it will not make you ineffective. Jesus was questioned, resisted, and criticized, yet authority never wavered. When you bind, do not expect universal agreement. Expect spiritual response. Heaven's agreement outweighs earthly resistance. This confidence protects you from discouragement. Faith becomes inwardly secure, not externally dependent. Binding also exposes the danger of neutrality. Silence is agreement when authority is given. Jesus never suggested neutrality was an option. Binding demands decision. When you know truth, hesitation becomes disobedience. This is not harsh, as clarifying. Faith thrives in clarity. Heaven responds quickly where clarity exists. Binding removes ambiguity. You know what you stand for and what you resist. This sharpness accelerates spiritual growth. As binding becomes habitual, discernment sharpens. You recognize what must be resisted and what must be endured. Not everything is bound, some things are faced with patience. Authority includes wisdom. Binding is not reckless action, it is spirit-led enforcement. Heaven honors discernment. Acting outside alignment weakens confidence, but acting in obedience strengthens it. This balance protects believers from extremes and keeps authority effective. Binding also changes how you view failure. Failure becomes feedback, not identity. If resistance persists, faith does not collapse. It recalibrates alignment. Authority grows through correction. Heaven is patient with learning faith. What matters is persistence. Binding is refined through experience. Each stand teaches something. Faith becomes seasoned. Authority becomes steady. When believers walk in binding, spiritual atmosphere shifts around them. Rooms feel lighter, conversations change, hope increases. This is not imagination, it is influence. Authority affects environment. Heaven's agreement manifests subtly but surely. People may not understand why they feel peace around you, but they benefit from it. Binding blesses beyond intention. It establishes order that others can rest in. Binding also guards against superstition. Authority is not ritual. It does not depend on posture, volume, or formula. It depends on faith aligned with truth. This frees believers from performance-based spirituality. Binding is simple yet profound. Speak truth, stand firm. Refuse contradiction, heaven responds. Complexity dissolves. Faith becomes accessible and practical. As authority grows, gratitude deepens. You realize this power is entrusted, not earned. Humility increases. Binding never makes you self-important. It makes you God-aware. You recognize partnership, not ownership. Heaven works through you, not because of you. This keeps the heart clean. Authority flows best through clean channels. Binding also reveals the seriousness of discipleship. Jesus did not invite spectators, he trained enforcers. Following him includes sharing his authority. This truth separates casual belief from committed faith. Binding requires discipline, word immersion, and obedience. It is not for the careless, but it is available to the willing. Heaven supplies strength to those who pursue truth sincerely. When believers neglect binding, culture fills the vacuum. Fear, compromise, and confusion dominate. But when faith rises, culture shifts. Binding has generational impact. What you resist today creates freedom tomorrow. Authority exercised now blesses others later. Heaven counts these acts. Nothing done in faith is wasted. Binding also corrects the false belief that time heals all things. Authority heals what time cannot. Delay without action strengthens bondage. Binding interrupts cycles. This makes faith urgent but not anxious. You act because you know heaven responds, not because you fear loss. Confidence replaces panic. As this truth settles, worship deepens. Praise flows from authority, not desperation. You worship because you know heaven is engaged. Binding and worship work together. Authority establishes victory, worship celebrates it. This balance produces joy. Faith becomes vibrant. Christianity becomes alive. Binding is not advanced spirituality, it is normal Christianity restored. Jesus expected believers to live this way. Heaven still agrees. The invitation remains. Faith must answer. When authority is fully embraced, faith stops asking whether it is God's will and starts standing on what God already revealed. Uncertainty dissolves because truth has been settled. Binding is not guessing, it is responding. Heaven does not operate on probability but on agreement. When you agree with God, heaven responds with force. This realization removes anxiety from spiritual life. You are no longer trying to unlock mysteries, you are enforcing known truth. Faith becomes calm, deliberate, and unwavering. Authority thrives in certainty. Binding also teaches believers to separate feelings from faith. Feelings fluctuate, but authority remains. Jesus never asked storms how he felt about them. He spoke truth despite sensation. When you bind, you speak above feelings, not denying them, but refusing to be ruled by them. This discipline matures faith quickly. Heaven responds to faith, not emotion. Emotional faith rises and falls, but authoritative faith stands. Binding trains believers to stand regardless of inner weather. As this authority becomes practiced, fear of failure disappears. Failure no longer threatens identity. You know who you are regardless of outcome. Authority is exercised from identity, not results. This frees faith to act boldly. Heaven supports bold obedience even while faith is learning. Binding invites growth. Faith that never risks never matures. Authority develops through use, not contemplation. Binding also clarifies spiritual priorities. You stop fighting unnecessary battles. Discernment increases. You recognize where authority must be exercised and where trust must be practiced. This balance protects peace. Heaven honors wisdom. Authority misused becomes strain, but authority guided by the Spirit produces rest. Binding becomes targeted, effective, and purposeful. When believers operate in binding, spiritual confidence spreads to others. Faith becomes contagious, not through persuasion but through presence. Authority creates assurance. People trust stability. Binding produces that stability. Heaven's agreement manifests as quiet strength. This strength speaks louder than argument. Binding reshapes the believer's relationship with Scripture. The Word is no longer inspirational text but legal authority. Promises become enforceable truth. You read not for comfort alone, but for alignment. The Word equips authority. Faith feeds on truth. Heaven responds to truth spoken in faith. Scripture becomes the foundation of binding, not decoration. As authority matures, patience deepens. You no longer rush outcomes. You trust process. Binding holds ground while heaven works. Faith rests without retreating. This patience is not passive, it is confident. Heaven honors patience rooted in certainty. Manifestation becomes inevitable, not questionable. Binding also eliminates jealousy in spiritual life. You are no longer threatened by others' authority. You recognize the same source. Heaven supplies without shortage. Authority is not competitive. When one believer stands, it strengthens the whole body. Binding produces unity, not rivalry. This truth also protects against spiritual pride. Authority does not exalt self. Each victory increases gratitude. You realize you are trusted, not superior. Heaven works through obedience, not ego. Binding remains effective where humility is preserved. As believers live this way, Christianity regains credibility. Faith becomes practical. Lives change visibly. Peace replaces chaos. Hope replaces despair. Heaven is glorified through ordinary believers walking in extraordinary authority. Binding restores authenticity. Binding also prepares believers for suffering without defeat. Authority does not remove all trials, but it prevents domination by them. You may face storms, but you do not drown. Faith stands even when answers delay. Heaven supports perseverance. Authority outlasts adversity. This understanding reshapes legacy. You are no longer living only for personal breakthrough, but for generational freedom. What you bind today limits what can pass forward. Authority exercised now blesses those you may never meet. Heaven values this obedience deeply. Binding finally reveals the heart of God's trust in humanity. He entrusted authority because he desired partnership. This trust dignifies believers. You are not insignificant. You are commissioned. Heaven responds because heaven invited agreement. When this truth settles fully, fear loses its voice. Excuses lose power. Faith rises naturally. Authority becomes normal. Christianity becomes alive. Heaven and earth cooperate as intended. This is the completion of the revelation. What you bind on earth truly is bound in heaven, and heaven is waiting for faith that dares to stand.